Well, hello and welcome to Her Hollywood Highlights with me, Lexi McKinney, and the one, the only, Joe Johnson.
Hey, thanks for having me, Lexi.
Well, thanks for joining me. So, this is the first episode. It's Halloween. So, very, very happy Halloween to all the listeners. We are so grateful to have you with us. So, a little backstory on Her Hollywood Highlights. This is the one stop podcast exploring all different genres of films. And, of course, what I think are some of the most iconic films over the years that I have just grown to love and constantly reiterate the lines of all my favorite characters. And it's just the best. So it's very exciting because Joe Johnson, right here with me today, and I have been talking about movies since I started my internship, honestly, which was back in May, which is
Yeah.
crazy. And so I had this awesome idea that I love movies and I love to talk about movies and how they make me feel. And everything that goes into production is just so fascinating. So I really wanted to kind of make a framework, a state of mind where I can talk about these things, get some other input from him. And he's met and seen some really cool things in movie history. So I can't wait to hear all of his input and what he gets to experience. And he's going to bring the spunk because he specializes in a lot of these cool films.
Well,
But,
my when I was a kid, going to the dollar show
mm-hmm.
was a cheap form of entertainment for my mom, who was raising four kids by herself. And so, almost any given weekend, my family was in a movie theater growing up.
Yeah.
Now, she was from Spain, and she kind of had that European mentality where she just let us see anything and
Really?
everything. And so, I've seen just about everything, and movies have always been a part of my life. And, growing up in Michigan in the Midwest, you kind of put Hollywood on this pedestal. It's like this magical place that's
Yeah.
unreachable. But then all of a sudden, I'm like, hey, I want to go to LA. And you go to LA and find out it's a place you can go. It's a place you can visit and experience that other side that you don't really get growing up in the Midwest.
You're so right. When I went to Hollywood, LA, when I was younger, I was in 4th grade. I remember it because it was like the most exciting field trip and I had this idea, Joe, that I was going to make like my own movie and send it to Hollywood and I thought that everything was going to be okay after that. Like no stress, no hassle. How old are you in 4th grade is going to produce her own film and that was going to be it. But then you go there and you just experience what it's like, and it's such a surreal feeling. Like, I can't even describe it other than surreal because it just feels so magical. And you just see all of the different avenues, the streets that you dream about, that you just, I don't know, it connects you to reality of movies.
It's not too late to do that film.
It's
You could still do that film and get the attention of Hollywood.
get the attention of Hollywood. That would be the goal. I don't even know what kind of movie. Maybe Scream?
Uh,
My own Scream?
there you go.
I don't know. There was talk that there was going to be another Scream added, the final edition of Scream, but something happened with some of the actresses in the recent sequels, and so there's all this drama. But maybe who knows? I'll make the Scream franchise one day, 20 years down the line, a whole different plot, and somehow connect it. But yeah, that's what we're talking about today for the first movie is Scream, which honestly, you were just saying, what was that statement that you made before we started about what Scream did to the
Well, it
horror?
brought back the slasher slash, pardon the pun, horror genre, where it had, the 80s. We describe the 80s as the golden age of slasher flicks and horror films. Some of the best, cheesiest slasher flicks came out in the 80s. And then there's kind of this overkill where people got a little tired of the slasher flick and it kind of went away for a little bit. Then all of
Yeah.
a sudden, this little movie comes along in the 90s that is a fan of slasher flicks and breaks down the rules and how things are supposed to play out in slasher flicks, all while the characters are part of a slasher
Slasher
flick. It
film.
was so surreal, but it was so clever and so well done that it re-energized the genre and a new generation of people discovered it.
I think what's cool about it too is that there was never a film that had the same type of concepts that it did establish. And
Mhm.
I guess at the time in the 90s, you didn't really look at a film and break it down the same way as I might now, or somebody that's interested in films might now, because you don't appreciate things until you watch, Ghostface and how he interacts, and of course the reveal at the end is like the jaw-dropping moment. Who did it? Who done it? Why did they do it? What connections do they have?
Yeah.
And honestly, just the base of it, we've got Billy Loomis, and he's my favorite Ghostface. I mean, he's the most iconic, and when you get the backstory, I mean, you see him and the chemistry between Sydney, and you're like, okay, they're meant to be. But then when you watch it a few times, and of course TikTok is my one-stop shop to watching different clues, or sometimes people will go out there and say this was a flaw in the film, like this is how you knew he was Ghostface. And
Mhm.
it's like these little details, and you go back and you're like, I didn't even think about that. Like you're just thinking about all these different pieces of a puzzle coming together when you see it for the first time. And I really love how every Scream movie was like that. That feeling of going into it and you have to figure out who done it and what the connections are.
Before we go any further, if you haven't seen Scream, I'm sure this podcast is going to be full of spoilers. So let us
Yeah.
warn you right now.
Red
But
flag.
there are some very clever twists in Scream,
Mhm.
and which kind of helped explain how Ghostface could be in, two places at the same time.
Mhm.
It was a very clever twist on the reveal, the Scooby-Doo reveal where you pull the mask off and go, "It's you, old man Loomis."
What's so iconic is what's his name? Oh my goodness. Matthew Lillard was Shaggy in Scooby Doo, and you just
That's
used
right.
that. I love that. That was a
So,
great
like,
connection. So I want to ask you this: what do you think about? So we know the opening scene, and we know that the voice disguise of Ghostface is just something iconic because now when you see people's Halloween costumes, they're always trying to incorporate that.
yeah.
But what were your essential thoughts when you've got the first opening scene in Scream, and how were you like, this is going to set the movie up for a lot of questions for me? What do you
Yeah.
think?
So the most one of the most fascinating things about the movie is prior to its release, it really made no secret that Drew Barrymore was in the movie, and I
Yeah.
think a lot of people were excited to see Drew Barrymore in this slasher flick. So we all went in, and here's Drew in the opening sequences, and then about 10 minutes into it, you're like, "What now? What just happened here? Is
What
she
went
is she
wrong?
okay? Is she
Yeah.
gonna be okay?" And it was a jaw dropper. It was a game changer that this star,
Mm-hmm.
who was heavily promoted in the film, she's the face on the poster with the wide
With
eyes,
the wide eyes and the
and it kind of paid homage to Psycho
Yep.
because Janet Leigh was in Psycho and she was billed as the star of Psycho, but she met her demise fairly early on in the film. Spoiler alert. So Scream, which again pays tribute to all the slasher and horror flicks that came before it, I think kind of took a page from Psycho and promoted this star that was going to be in this movie, and then had everyone like not knowing what to expect
In
once
awe.
you realized that they were going to off their star at the beginning of the movie.
And it's so different because when you have a name like Drew Barrymore, right? She is this icon and she continues to be. She's a beautiful woman. She's a very talented actress. She's got so many great things. But yes, no movie before Scream ever killed off the star like that.
Yeah.
But what I think is my favorite part about the opening scene and what always sticks with me is that it's like such a real scenario of what you're afraid of, right? Is
Oh,
like
yeah.
there's that stereotype of, you're home alone and you're talking on a phone with a stranger and you're like thinking the worst, right? It's kind of creepy, it's eerie, it's dark out. Like that would be so me is just kind of freaking out and panicking and she doesn't realize. But I know that you haven't seen some of the new Scream, but I really like how what's the Scream? It's the first Scream where they kind of did like the rebrand, which I think was in like 2022 maybe or
Okay.
2021. And they use the opening scene very similarly, but also different. You see much more fighting, much more trying to figure out what they're doing here. Are they just remaking the original Scream? Because it's very
Yeah.
similar, right? Except it has kind of tributes to different horror films nowadays, right? So it's a little bit more updated version. But that's just something so iconic, and you see the spoofs, and you see so many people reenacting that scene,
Yeah.
and it
Well,
brings it together.
the problem with the sequels is, Scream was so original and had some great twists that the sequels were like, how do we up our game? How do we give somebody something new but still give them what they expect? And so the sequels have sort of become this, well, how do we give a twist or how do we do a twist that shocks everybody? And that seems to be the motivation for doing these films, is trying to come up with variations on the first film. And
Mm-hmm.
so obviously none of the sequels are going to be as good as the first one. And I think the last one I saw was the last one that Neve Campbell did. She's going to be
Okay.
coming back to the franchise,
Yeah.
but the last one that she was in, I didn't really care for it all that much because it lacked a lot of the fun of the first one, the playfulness.
Mm-hmm.
They just tried to be very graphic. There's some scenes that come to mind that just really kind of turned me off.
Yeah.
So I'm not a fan of the sequels. I am intrigued that Neve is going to be coming back because she took a movie off because of a pay dispute. You were alluding to that at the beginning
Mm-hmm.
of the podcast. There was a pay dispute, so she sat one out, and they said, "Okay, we can't do this without her." So they made an offer she couldn't refuse. So she's going to be coming back for, I think, 7 maybe. So yeah, so the sequels, and this goes for just about any movie, they never really live up to the original. The original is always going to be a classic. So
And it's always hard because for me, Billy Loomis was like the icon. That was my crush, right? When I saw him, I was like, oh, he's crazy. But then the other thing is that you see in the sequels later on that the motives change a lot. And I know that they kind of had to do that so it's not the same story repeated. But some of them are really great. Like when it was Billy Loomis's mom in the second Scream, like
mhm.
totally great way to bring her into it and have like an actual demeanor. But some of them, some of the newer ones that you'll see, it's like it was a little bit more obvious where I think some of the older movies, it's not as obvious.
Yeah.
Maybe that's just me thinking about it. But some of it, it's the new kid, it's the roommate, and spoiler alert, and kind of spoiler to you, I won't say who the other Screams are because there's actually 3 in that one. But
Yeah.
it's it's a different way of doing it. But I really am curious what the last one's gonna curtail. And part of me wishes that, I mean, I know that Billy Loomis's daughter is like the key character, and in the recent one, you actually see flashbacks, and you see kind of these moments of monologue and then dialogue between his daughter and him, like in a flashback, like he's visiting her.
Mm.
And I like that connection because it kind of has a little bit more of an overlaying process. There's more detail in it. You have to think about things. It makes good connections. But for me, one thing I wanted to talk about, which I don't even know if you know this fun fact. Maybe you do. So you know how the Ghostface mask and he's got the black cape on, or
Mhm.
whoever's Ghostface has the black cape on. It was originally supposed to be white. Did you know that?
No, I didn't know that.
Yeah, so when they were starting everything with the series and of course developing the production and the costumes and what of course characters are going to develop and how they're going to develop or if they're going to be killed off right away, whatever the case may be, poor rip Drew Barrymore. um, but it was supposed to be white because it was supposed to be more of a
A
ghost.
ghostly figure, yeah.
Yes, but of course I think that they realized the depth and everything and they wanted to change that element and I'm glad they did because man, it's one of my favorite costumes. I mean, that and Michael Myers, the two I think creepiest in my opinion. Jason just felt, I don't know, he was missing something to me. Something was missing, but I understood that he was a really good killer. And Freddy, I don't know, I just never got into the Nightmare before.
It was
Or
cool in
Nightmare,
the 80s. That was fun. I got a trivia question for you. Do you
Oh,
know
no.
the original name before they settled on Scream? What was the movie going to be called before
Oh.
it was called Scream?
Not Stab? No, what was it? What was it? You said this
I-
before, I think, to
I-
me.
Now you got me wondering because Stab was the name of the movie that was based on the incidents that happened in the movie, right?
Right.
I seem to recall reading that the movie was originally going to be called Scary Movie. And then you might have to
Oh.
verify this, but I
Oh.
think it was going to be called Scary Movie. Then they went with Scream. But then when they did the parody of Scream, they called
Did it-
that one Scary Movie. So I might have to verify that, but that's what
No,
I seem to
I
recall
actually
reading.
didn't know that. I assumed it was Stab because I figured that they were just going to kind of make that connection,
Yeah.
even if they didn't use it for the actual movie. I'm Googling, let's see what the internet says. Yeah,
Well,
Scary Movie.
There you go. See, I know stuff.
He knows a few
I'm the
things, you'll
guy.
see. So speaking of this, though, I really do want to make this connection because I feel like we kind of have to. If you know Joe Johnson as well as I do now, Joe Johnson seems to be at the right place at the right time almost all the time when it comes to movies and seeing iconic cars and people and everything.
And
And
filming
so,
locations.
in filming locations, that's the other thing is, do you know, actually I'm going to ask you this, do you know where the house is from the Scream movie?
Not off the top of my head. It's not here in Michigan, is it? It's I would have to look
Where
that
is
up.
the
I know it's a
Scream?
place that fans of the movie visit. I just don't remember what the address is, but
California.
it is in
It's
California.
in
Okay.
California.
I'll have to add that to
Yeah.
my list.
Man, well, it says it was rebuilt, it looks like during Scream 3, so it seems
Oh,
like I don't know, it gives an address, so I would definitely,
yeah.
wanna pop by that, but anyway, going back to our connections, you've actually met some of the characters from Scream, is this right?
Yeah, and it's not something I deliberately set out to do. A year or two ago, I decided to rewatch the original Scream for Halloween, and as I
Mhm.
was watching the film, it dawned on me. I'm like, well, I've met that person. And then as I'm watching the movie, I'm like, I've met that person and that person and that person. And I'm up to at least 6 actors now that were in the Scream movies. Now, the first cast member that I met was long before Scream.
Mhm.
I was living in LA. Some friends came to visit. I took them to Venice Beach.
Okay.
And a long black limo pulled up, and a
Oh,
bunch of
boy.
teenagers got out and it looked like they were having a party. And one of the people that stepped out of the limo was Drew Barrymore. And not a lot of people recognized her because she had been like an ET and Firestarter and stuff like that, but
Yeah.
she hadn't done the real big mainstream stuff that came later. And so my buddy just happened to have a camera. So I said, "Hey, get your camera ready." And I walked over to her and said, "Can I get a picture with you, Miss Barrymore?" And she said, "Yes, of course." And she was all smiles and very sweet. And so I got a picture with her. And then all her friends were like teasing her and stuff. So that was my first experience. Of course, she went on later to do Scream.
Mhm.
But then an uncredited role in Scream, which is interesting. I think he was the principal, was Henry Winkler,
Mhm.
who played Fonzie on Happy Days and have done
Oh,
a
Happy
lot of
Days.
stuff since
Mhm.
then.
Yep.
I've met him several times. He's been at the Autorama and the Motor City Comic Con, and we keep crossing paths for some reason. I've met him
Maybe
multiple times.
there must be some reason. Maybe you're gonna produce a. I don't even know. It's
I don't
Joe
know. It's just a
Johnson.
universal thing, but
Yeah.
and then some friends of mine, when I was visiting LA, we went to a comedy club, the Hollywood Improv, and one of the performers that night was a guy named Jamie Kennedy.
Oh my
And
goodness.
he was nice enough after the show to hang out and take pictures. And so he's the guy who presents in the film all the rules of the
Of
horror
the
film
horror
and
film,
never
yeah.
never say, "I'll be right back,"
Back,
that sort of
yeah.
stuff. But then the big one, I
Mhm.
never thought I would have an opportunity to meet her, but the big one, of course, was Nev Campbell.
Oh my goodness,
Yeah,
Sydney!
she was at the Motor City Comic Con a number of years ago, and I was there working. I was shooting video, but I also wanted just an opportunity to meet her and get a photo with her. So I didn't
Mhm.
have my gear with me. I stood in line. I paid money to get a photo with her. She was very sweet. And
Mhm.
then the next day, we were walking around with my gear, and the Comic Con people said, "Do you want to interview with Nev Campbell?" And I'm like, "I'd be surprised if she agreed to it, but you could ask." So they approached her. They said, "This guy wants to do an interview with you," and she said, "Yeah, bring him over." So
So we
went over
actually
and did the interview.
So Joe was so gracious enough to actually let us use that interview with Nev on the podcast today. Great way to start off this podcast. So thank you so much. So you're hearing it right now, the very one and only interview with Nev Campbell and Joe Johnson.
What's it like having people come up and tell you how much your work means to them?
It's pretty amazing. I think as a screen actor, you don't get that immediate response from an audience like you do when you're on stage. So for us to come out and meet the fans and hear their opinions and see how we have some kind of an impact is really lovely.
Speaking of impact, let's talk about the Scream franchise, what it did for the horror genre and what it meant to you in your career.
Everything. For the horror genre, it's said that it brought the genre back. I think there had been a big lull in horror films, and we were lucky that we hit at the right time and made a good movie. And Kevin Williamson and Wes Craven as a combo were just incredibly bright with what they did with the film, with sort of making a horror film with a wink at the horror film genre at the same time. It was very intelligent. So that was exciting. And for me, it was my first lead in a movie, and it did really well. So I was lucky.
It looked fun.
It was a lot of fun. We had a blast on these movies.
So yeah, that was a genuine thrill to actually have a conversation with her. And
Yeah.
since then, Skeet Ulrich, your guy, and Matthew Lillard
My
have
guy.
come to the Motor City Comic Con, and
Yeah.
so I snapped some photos of them, and they just have so much fun with their fans.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of times when you go to these Comic Cons, some of the stars stay behind their table. You pay
Yeah.
for a photo or an autograph, and they sign the thing, and it's like an assembly line. But those two guys, they're not sitting behind their table. They're mingling. They're hugging. They're handshakes, photos. It was really cool to watch those two guys interact with their fans.
It is too, and I think that their personality, in the movie, they obviously have a goofy relationship a little bit. I mean, you just see it, and I think they had good chemistry going into it. And it's so great that they know how iconic Scream will always be to generations. Now in generations in the past too. I mean, for me, I didn't get to live through when it came out, but man, when I hear stories of what it was like to see this movie,
Oh, it was
does
a
it make me
blast.
so
Like I said,
jealous.
horror movies, slasher films had kind of gone away, and this brought it all back, and it was a thrill to watch this movie in the theater.
It's just the cleverest way to take a horror movie and basically lay out why we like horror movies. I mean,
Yeah.
that's really what it was. Is it was a way for us to say, hey, what makes a really good horror movie? Because you can see so many plots. I mean, nowadays there's so many horror movies that come out. I believe there's one called Smile that came out, and I haven't
Yeah.
seen it yet, but I hear things about it, and I guess I had assumptions of it following kind of this one plot line that a lot of movies similar have followed. Then I hear what pertained in the second Smile, and everyone's like, "Oh my goodness, you have to see it! It brings back to life what we want in horror films." And I'm thinking,
Huh.
well, that's what Scream was to a lot of people back in the '90s.
Yeah.
So it's really, really interesting to see that.
I do
But-
have a question for you.
hmm
What's your favorite horror movie?
My favorite horror movie, Joe Johnson, is Halloween. Okay, let me think.
Okay.
Well, I'll tell you this. I have a couple different reasons for it. I love Scream because I love the idea, but I've seen all the Scream and they blend together a little bit. Like after the second Scream, the other ones, I remember the one with it's Emma Roberts, right? Because
I don't remember.
Oh, you don't remember? Well, she was Sydney's cousin, and
Ah.
they had a really great fight scene. So that's what I kind of want to be partial, but also because Billy Loomis just really brought, for me, he was the best Ghostface. And I don't know why. I think maybe I was in awe of just his personality, his persona, even though he was a psychopath, basically. But I love the Scream movies for that. But I just think that Jamie Lee Curtis in Halloween, the whole storyline and backstory between Michael Myers, his family, what happened to him as a child, and what carried on throughout his lifetime, and how she just lives through it every single time. I love the Halloween movies. I love Michael Myers.
Yeah, they kind of set the standard for everything that came afterward, Friday the 13th and all that stuff that came after that. But surprisingly, it wasn't necessarily the first one to delve into that.
Yeah.
Texas Chainsaw Massacre came out before that, and a movie that I saw when I was way too young. I was 10 years old when I saw a movie called The Town That Dreaded Sundown. And the scariest
Oh,
thing about
wait.
that particular movie is it's based on actual
Events that happened.
yeah. So there were a couple of movies that came out before Halloween, but Halloween like checked off all the boxes of what you should expect in a horror movie, a slasher flick, and everybody's just been trying to imitate Halloween ever since then.
I don't think they'll ever get it. They have the theme song too. It's just like Ghostface has Ghostface, right? That is the symbol of the film. And the symbol too is that you can reiterate lines. You know the iconic scene in the beginning with Drew Barrymore. You know how it's going to end with Sydney. And you just see things play out where for me, Halloween, there's one thing, and I always talk about this with my dad, and that's just the fact that the Halloween, for whatever reason, it always like I have to watch it. No matter how many times I see it, it never gets old for me. And my dad says the same thing, and I don't know why we're like this, but like he bought this blow up the other day for me, and it's a Michael Myers. I'll have to send you a picture. And he's got like a bobblehead. He's like one of those fat head Michael Myers. But there's just something about it. I don't know. I just love watching it. It never really was scary to me just because I've watched them so many times. I knew what would happen. But watching the newer ones, you have such great expectations of the older ones that watching the new ones, you have a hard time appreciating them. And it's not that they were bad films or anything.
Yeah.
But I watched the most recent Halloween, which I believe was the last Halloween that they were using with Jamie Lee Curtis. And have you watched it at all?
not that one. My favorite Halloween movie after the original was Halloween H2O.
Okay.
It was released on the 20th anniversary of Halloween, and they
Mhm.
did bring Jamie Lee back for that
For that
particular
one.
film. And I
Mhm.
love that one, but I really haven't seen any other ones that have come out since.
The new one, I don't want to spoil too much, but I kind of have to say this because it does make me still think. I saw it in theater. I believe I actually saw it the day it came out. I had to get those tickets because I was so excited. And you saw so many people again, just like when the new reboots of Scream came out, is everyone was wearing their favorite T-shirts and really enacting and
Mhm.
bringing this like theater full of like-minded people that just love a good classic horror film. But for me, the storyline kind of set up that even though Michael Myers was not going to make it, basically there's going to be a final battle between him and Jamie Lee Curtis, and it was going to be the sibling rivalry that we all been waiting for, and just an end to it finally, an end to the madness. But you do see Michael have a soft side for one character that he does
Hmm.
not kill immediately and has multiple opportunities to.
Interesting.
And what I love about it is that this character, I think, reminded Michael of himself because it's a very similar story. The character killed somebody, right? And completely changed who he was. And
Hmm.
then he believes that he's this dark, like, supposed to be Michael. And he starts to try to be Michael. And then we see how that goes for him. But I was like, that would have been the coolest way to spin off the Halloween series, is if Michael let this guy live
To
and we
become the
see
new.
who,
Yeah.
like, what's his name going to be? Is he going to be Michael Myers 2.0? I don't think you can replace Michael Myers. He
Yeah.
might hunt you down on Halloween night. I don't know. But it just makes me excited to see what you can do with films. And oh, goodness, what I would do to be on the set of one of these horror films.
Well, I think I told you that there's a neighborhood in Pasadena where you can visit the filming locations of the original Halloween.
Mhm.
I think they moved one of the houses. Maybe it was Michael Myers' house. I think got moved, but you can still visit Laurie Strode's house and
Yeah.
the neighborhood and the babysitter's house and all that stuff. So
Babysitter's
that's on
house.
my to-do list.
It's always too, you know the scene, what Halloween is this in, where she's like looking out the window and she sees Michael kind of in the
Standing.
curtains. Yeah, the curtains.
Yeah,
are-
yeah.
that scene, for some reason, every time the fall crisp air comes, I just think to that scene because I can just envision what it was like, and that's what I would imagine. And for her character too, it's like she never caught a break, but again, it's
Yeah.
what makes it good. I know we
Yeah.
went off on a tangent, but there's just so much good horror stuff to talk about nowadays. I want to end this with hearing a little bit of input from Joe on this topic. So back to Scream. What is one thing about Scream that you would change if you could change anything? We'll just talk about the original because it gets really too complicated with all of them. But what's one thing that you think could have improved the film, if anything?
You know, you would think I'd have an answer ready for that, but I don't. If you were to have a podcast on the perfect movies
Mhm.
that have, not a lot you can complain about, I think Scream is very close to a perfect movie. I really do. There's not a whole lot I would change. I love the twists. I love everything about it. There's no part of that movie where I get bored or get
Mhm.
upset. You asking that question makes me wonder: do you find flaw in the film? Because I think it's pretty close to perfect.
I don't find a ton of flaw, but there's one thing, and I think I've already kind of touched on it, what my answer would be. I just would have wanted Billy Loomis to survive. And there's so many reasons why. There's so many ideas in my head of what we could have done in the series with him back in different ways. But, I mean, again, the newer films, they do bring him back. They bring his ghost back, if you will, kind of
Interesting.
iconic. And they basically, he teaches his daughter through these moments of her dreaming about him and envisioning him in a scenario. They teach how to be the perfect killer in a movie, basically. And he like goes through all the rules, which I think is kind of a fun way to do it.
Yeah.
But there's just so much potential. And he's just the face. When you go on TikTok, it's so crazy how many females post videos and just these different edits together of him. And they're like, this is the reason that I like horror film, is just because he played such a perfect ghost face. But I want to give credit to Sydney, too, because her character has seen so much development throughout the franchise. And how many times can you be in fights with these crazy psychopaths? And what's the motive behind it? And who's your friend group going to be? And how many times can you trust new people?
Yeah.
That's my question for her, is if I could ask
Yeah.
her character, Nev's character, anything. How many times are you going to let this happen before you just say, I'm going to buy myself a private island and head elsewhere by myself? Because I couldn't do it much longer.
Yeah. Now, if I were to point out one thing in the film that might come across as a flaw, in reality, it's part of the whole appeal of the movie. But, Nev is being attacked in a home, Sydney, but instead of, running out the front door, she runs up the stairs.
Yeah.
Now, someone might say, well, why don't you just leave the house? That's the whole point of the movie, is that people in slasher films don't do the things that normal, rational people would do. So you say, well, that's a flaw, but it's not. It's part of the charm of the movie.
It'd be interesting to see. I'm sure there is a movie out there. I don't know of one, but that goes against the stereotypes of that, right?
Yeah.
Like the running away or the common tripping right in front before the killer comes to catch you, because you know that there's some slow serial killers in these movies. I mean,
Yeah,
come
right.
on, let's be real. Michael Myers is going to put his tennis shoes on and chase after you. No, you're just slow in the movies because you're just not moving quick enough to get out of his way.
If you wanna watch a slasher flick that takes the whole genre and turns it on its head, you got to see a movie called Tucker and Dale versus Evil. It is outstanding.
Is it?
It's funny in the way that Scream is funny, but it takes the whole genre and just
Flips
does a
it.
big 180. So maybe tonight, if you can find it on Apple or something like that, watch Tucker and Dale versus
Tucker and
Evil.
Dale. Who knows? I might like it so much we talk about it in weeks to
There
come.
you go.
Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Well, this has been the first episode of Her Hollywood Highlights, and what a blast. We covered Scream, and what we love about this Her Hollywood Highlights podcast is that we talk about all genres. This is horror this week, but next week we're going to be talking about Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, which is one of my favorite movies. And guess what? Joe Johnson has a very special comment to make about something that he got to witness about this movie when it was in production.
Yeah.
And so we get to cover every single week what we love about it, maybe what we don't love about it. These are all of my favorite movies, but Joe might say, I don't know. Right now, we're 1 for 1. We both agree Scream is an
definitely.
iconic classic.
Yep.
We both agree that Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is also a classic in its own way.
I will agree.
And it's got so many things that we need to dissect about it because, oh my goodness, I could talk for days. And it's going to be exciting. So we will see you next time. Thanks so much. We got to hear a very special, unique interview with Nev Campbell and Joe Johnson. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll see you next time to discuss all the galore about Once Upon a Time in Hollywood.